everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar. We are extremely happy and grateful that you are so many to turn up and join us today. I'm Lola Vallejo, the Climate Program Director at IDDRI based in Paris. And I'm extremely happy today to welcome our three panelists. I will start by introducing Alden Meyer. Alden is a senior associate at E3G working on US and international climate policy and politics. Rueanna Haynes is senior legal advisor of the climate diplomacy team at Climate Analytics and AOSIS support team lead. And we're also joined by Rashmi, a distinguished fellow and program director at the Earth Science and Climate Change Center at TERI, based in New Delhi. I will hear from our three panelists today, one after the other, after a short introduction. And that should leave us about 30 to 45 minutes of Q&A. If you have questions as they speak, maybe feel free to send them in the chat box directly, and I'll give the floor to the panelists afterwards. So the purpose of the webinar today is to try and take a stop back at the Climate Leaders Summit that was convened by the new Biden administration, and to really take a moment to consider what the summit has achieved compared to what were its outcomes, stated and implicit, and also to consider how this summit is paving the way for climate diplomacy on the road to Glasgow's COP26 in November. We thought it was important to bring a variety of viewpoints on this because obviously, depending on where you stand, you'll have very different takes on how the summit went. But ultimately, it's important to acknowledge this as an important moment on the road to COP26. And I won't go into a very detailed listing of what happened, but ultimately this was about the US proving it was back in the race of climate action and demonstrating domestic engagement on climate in terms of mitigation, but also finance, but also proving its convening power by having the highest level of attendance from 40 countries. At the summit, we heard from more information regarding what some countries were planning in the short term. So not only the US, but also Canada and Japan presented updated climate commitments to 2030. And we also heard some subtle shifts and signals from a range of countries from the global south, including China and South Africa, but also South Korea. There are also a range of other sectoral initiatives worth mentioning, such as the joint Denmark and US mission to decarbonize international shipping, or a new initiative to lower emission by accelerating forest finance, including a range of African countries. So a lot happened at this summit. And without further ado, I would like to maybe give the floor first to Alden to give us his perspective from the US on what was really behind the administration's mind when they tried to convene it, and what is the American perspective on the summit itself. Thank you very much, Alden. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lola, and it's good to be with you. Thanks for doing this. I think we're still digesting the summit outcomes, so this is a good chance to have a take on that and see where we're at. So as Lola said, I am a senior associate with E3G based out of Washington. For many years, some of you may have known me as the Director of Strategy and Policy for the Union of Concerned Scientists. I just want to start before going to the summit to give you a little bit of grounding on the Biden-Harris climate agenda, because this has been a long time in the making. They campaigned with climate emergency and addressing it as one of their 4 top priorities for governance. in addition to, of course, the priority of recovering from the COVID-19 health and economic crises and addressing racial injustice in the US. They are taking an all-of-government approach to confronting climate change that far exceeds what we've seen in any previous administration, including the Obama-Biden administration, and they have built an exceptionally talented team in the White House and across the federal agencies to move this agenda. I'm not going to go through this, but this is just to give you a sense of the scale and scope of their agenda. And this is not something they started working on when they took office on January 20th. These were key plans that they detailed in their campaign, drawing on some of the best analysis and policy recommendations from some of their rivals in the campaign, such as Governor Inslee and Senator Elizabeth Warren. And they have strategies in place driving forward each of these agendas using government regulation, government procurement, loan guarantees, information programs, everything they can do to move this domestic decarbonization agenda. They're also, of course, pursuing several efforts to restrict fossil fuel emissions as they do this, restoring the National Environmental Protection Act, climate impacts analysis, updating and restoring the social cost of carbon estimates, which feed into government regulation and other decisions, restricting fossil fuel production on public lands and moving forward to put in place oil and gas methane controls. Huge set of announcements that Janet Yellen is honchoing at the Treasury Department, along with other agencies such as the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Commodity Future Trading Commission, and others, on corporate disclosure and stress testing of business models against climate risk. And they voiced support for state and local damages litigation against fossil fuel companies for the costs of climate impacts. On the congressional front, of course, you know, they have launched a huge infrastructure stimulus bill, over $2 trillion, with a big chunk of that going for clean energy technology, updating the grid, electric vehicle infrastructure, buildings, heavy industry, et cetera. They'll be pursuing sectoral initiatives in the Congress. They are proposing major ramp ups in both domestic and international funding for climate and clean energy initiatives, and they're working on tax policy incentives for clean technology. Now, of course, there are a number of barriers to what they're trying to do in the US. They have to focus on the recovery from COVID-19 and restarting the economy. That's job one. But as you see with the infrastructure bill, they're weaving in addressing the climate emergency to how we recover from COVID and get our economy going again. Of course, they're dealing with the narrowest of margins in the Congress, particularly in the Senate, where it's a 50-50 margin, with Vice President Harris having to break ties, and a dysfunctional Republican Party on climate. And I think that's one of our long-term goals as NGOs in the US, is to shift the politics within the Republican Party so we don't have a party dominated by climate deniers. Of course, they have to be aware of more conservative federal courts, including the 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court, which could limit their ability to move through the Clean Air Act and other domestic legislation. They have to make sure that they prepare for litigation from Republican-led states and industries. And of course, the power of the fossil fuel industry, which remains quite strong in American politics. But despite all this, I am optimistic that we are at a Churchill moment where the US is back in the game and can help restore leadership on climate. That's not to say that there's not concerns that I've heard internationally about the prospect of US politics flipping back again in 2025. But as Special Envoy Kerry has said, there's a lot that can be done in the next 4 years to lock in some of these trends against that possibility. So talking about the Biden administration's international climate priorities, of course, rejoining Paris on day one, you can check that one off. Convening a leader summit in the first 100 days, you can check that one off. Submitting an ambitious NDC, the US did that. They knew they had no authority to convene a leader summit if they hadn't walked the talk and put forward an ambitious NDC of their own. Fulfilling the Green Climate Fund pledge and ramping up climate finance, I would say this is a work very much in progress. They are not requesting the full $2 billion that the US is in arrears on the Green Climate Fund. in the current budget year. They did ask for $1.25 billion, with the rest to be made up later. But of course, many other of the developed countries have since the US made that pledge in 2015, have done another round of funding, many of them doubling their initial pledge. So there's a lot more for the US to do in the climate finance space. And I think you can argue that they have made climate a priority in foreign trade and national security policy more than any US administration in history. So at the summit, as you were saying, Lola, it was partly a statement that the US is back, the US is willing to help assert leadership again on the climate issue. I think it's significant that this was the first major international initiative of the Biden-Harris administration. They put a lot of muscle into this, a lot of diplomatic outreach we can talk about in the Q&A aimed at different countries, and they really worked the whole system. They used their cabinet secretaries, they used the Secretary of State, obviously John Kerry did a lot of travel around the world, and even more virtual meetings with counterparts around the world. This was really an all-in moment for the administration. If you look at this list from the Climate Action Tracker coming out of the summit of where we stand, I think you can sort of separate the countries into three categories. You have those where the US had a fair amount of diplomatic leverage, and including on Canada, on Japan, on South Korea, where you saw some pretty major announcements. South Korea did agree to phase out international finance for coal and promised that it would put forward a strengthened NDC before COP26. There are bets on whether that will be at the P4G summit next month in South Korea, or at the G7 summit in Cornwall in early June, which South Korea has been invited to. But I think you can see the impact of US diplomatic engagement with Canada, Japan, and South Korea. If you had told me at the beginning of this year that Japan would be committing to a 46 to 50% emissions reduction by 2030, frankly, I would have asked you what you were smoking. But I think the combination of good domestic pressure plus the US engagement really did move the needle on these countries. Then, of course, you've got some of the countries I would say were basically gaslighting at the summit. Countries like Scott Morrison from Australia, or Bolsonaro from Brazil, or President Putin from Russia, who basically were talking the green line and talking about net zero and talking about climate action in a way that's totally at odds with what's going on in those countries. And I think one of the tests for the US going forward and other countries going forward is how you expose that disconnection between the rhetoric and the reality in those countries. The US made a decision, because of restarting the Major Economies Forum, that it would invite all 17 original members of the MEF, which of course included Australia, Brazil, and Russia. There was no sort of criteria to play in the summit the way there was with the UK Climate Ambition Summit last December. But that being said, I think we need to figure out stronger accountability strategies around some of these countries. And then there are other countries where they made some announcements at the summit, such as China, India, and others, where the US frankly does not have as much diplomatic leverage as it does with some of its developed country allies. And I think there we need to have a much more integrated strategy between the US, the EU, and the UK to reach out to these countries in the run-up to COP26 and figure out how to get some more movement. I'm very much looking forward to Dr. Rashmi's comments on India and the significance of the Prime Minister's statement there, and what we can expect on the US and other countries helping assemble the finance and technology package India needs to decarbonize its economy. China, I would say you could take the announcement by President Xi that in the 15th five-year plan and the second half of this decade, China will gradually constrain coal emissions. Combine that with the statement, the US-China joint statement out of the Shanghai summit between Kerry and Minister Xie Zhenhua about the need for increased ambition in the 2020s, and say that the expectations have been raised for more concrete action by China before COP26. So that's kind of the landscape coming out of the summit on ambition. This is another slide from the Climate Action Tracker folks about what this adds up to. Good news is that it did announce, the announcements did accumulate to around a 2.5 to 3.5 gigaton carbon emissions reduction by 2030. But as Climate Action Tracker points out, that's only about a 12 to 14% decrease in the overall ambition gap. So we still have a lot of work to do. And I would say we have to acknowledge that even with much greater ambition, even if we meet much more of the ambition gap by 2030 and on our path to net zero, that impacts will continue to intensify because of past emissions in the atmosphere. And what we're experiencing now is almost certainly going to get worse in the years and decades ahead. And that means that we need to ramp up dramatically support for adaptation and for loss and damage. And I think there you would have to give the summit a fairly poor grade, with the exception of the US announcing its intention to double its overall climate, international climate finance over the next 4 years and triple its adaptation assistance. You didn't see many other countries joining in there. Partly that's because the US is catching up from the Trump years with some of the other developed countries. But I think there's not the acknowledgement, particularly on the loss and damage front, of the scale of what's coming at developing countries and the need to really ramp up assistance to them. And as I often say, there are limits to adaptation. This is kind of a humorous slide, but with a very serious message that there are crises happening as we speak in communities and countries around the world. And as an international community, we are not really responding to them adequately. And I think that's something that the UK, the US, and others have to address between now and COP26. Just to end with a few thoughts about the road ahead. Some of the things we need to get out of Glasgow, as I mentioned, we need to get much more movement on countries that haven't committed to net zero emissions doing so. And importantly, other countries that have made commitments to net zero, closing the gap between those long-term commitments and near-term action. As I just mentioned, we need a very strong solidarity package for the vulnerable countries. We need progress on just transition. A major part of the Biden administration's agenda here is working with coal communities, with oil and gas communities, to say what is the transition pathway forward as we decarbonize our economy. That's important not only because it's the right thing to do. Those communities and workers should not bear a disproportionate share of the burden of decarbonization. It's also the politically smart thing to do. We don't need more gilets jaunes backlashes against climate action in the social space. Of course, there is some unfinished business at Glasgow on Article 6, common timeframes, transparency rules. Those have to be finalized with strong environmental integrity. And we need to make sure that there's greater space for the voices of Indigenous, marginalized, and civil society groups to be heard in Glasgow. Of course, the Leaders Summit was just kicking off a very busy schedule for the rest of the year, as we know, leading up to the G7 Leaders Summit in early June, the G20 Finance Ministers, G20 Leaders Summits, UN summits on and international summits on global health, on food systems, the Convention on Biological Diversity, COP in China. So there's just a host of things, new opportunities, I think, for more progress. And the Biden administration and Special Envoy Kerry would be the first to say the job is by no means done. This is not a one and done summit. This was sort of launching a year of action in the run up to COP. And then finally, I would just say that, of course, COP is not the end of the road in Glasgow. We need to be looking forward to COP27 in Africa, COP28 in Asia, the global stock take. We need to be looking forward to the German and Japanese G7 presidencies and the Indonesian and Indian G20 presidencies, because this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. Thanks a lot, and I'll leave it there, Lola.
Thank you so much, Alden. It was incredibly effective. I have so many questions as a follow-up, but I don't want to abuse my privilege as a moderator, and maybe I'll move on to our next speaker. I would like to maybe now give the floor to Rueanna Haynes to give a perspective from the developing countries side. Rueanna.
Thank you, Lola, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It's definitely a pleasure to be here. I'm really happy that I'm going after Alden's very comprehensive presentation that did address some of the key points that I think I would like to raise. But I guess from a developing countries perspective, in particular from a SIDS perspective, I would want to raise three major points on the conference and what it meant and how it's been received. The first point is on reasons for optimism. And I think Alden did address some of these reasons for optimism. The fact that we have taken what seems to be a very good step in the right direction. The Climate Action Tracker describes this movement, this 12 to 14% movement in addressing the 2030 emissions gap as the largest we have ever seen. And that in itself is, I think, a clear reason for optimism that we have started this year heading in the right direction. I think the hope is that we can continue to build on this throughout all of the engagements that are planned at various levels, leaders as well as ministerial level, as well as the technical level throughout the year on the road to COP26. From a vulnerable country perspective, I think very much a part of this reason for optimism is the clear message that we are aiming for that 1.5 degrees Celsius limit for global average temperature. And this is not something insignificant, considering the fact that the Major Economies Forum meeting that took place in 2008, I believe it was, in the lead up to the Poznan COP, when we were working on having what should have been, well, what should have been the Copenhagen Agreement. At that MEF meeting, there was a clear consensus around setting this long-term temperature limit at 2 degrees Celsius. And here we are, several years later, where, according to the White House readout on the summit, there is now a clear momentum for action in getting to that 1.5 degree limit, or getting on track or staying on track for the 1.5 degree limit. And this for us is a clear reason for optimism. This is, very much the culmination of a multi-year campaign that only just now seems to be bearing fruit. And I think the real question is, will we be able to get there in time? That's the question that we need to be asking ourselves on every front. The second issue that I would want to raise here focuses a little bit on the domestic efforts of the US, which are very, very welcome. Alden gave a bit of an overview of the amount of work that the Biden-Harris administration had done in preparation for this summit. And it's very, I think, encouraging to see the US whole of government approach on this question of ambitious climate action. This is welcome. It is extremely, it's extremely refreshing in the sense that you have, the largest global economy sort of leading the way and finally showing how we can live this dream on sustainable development. The 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda on the idea that economic development and action or environmental action does not have to be going in two different directions. And that's a powerful symbol and a powerful message. In terms of some of their specific announcements, they've made announcements on several different initiatives, including very much in support of adaptation efforts with vulnerable countries in the Caribbean, as well as the Pacific, technical assistance as well on the renewable energy front. And this was also extremely welcome. I think I very much agree with Alden's point on the fact that when we look at climate finance, yes, it's very good that the US now for the first time has an international climate finance plan. Yes, it's good that they're doubling finance by 2024 and tripling adaptation finance by 2024, but they do have a lot of ground to cover. And it's not as yet clear, especially given all of the challenges that they face in their domestic political situation, whether, if or how they are going to be able to cover that ground. And that's one unanswered question that we have. So the third basket of issues I want to raise pertains to this idea of unanswered questions. And so we've had the summit. The summit, by most measures, can be considered a success. The US is back. They've demonstrated seriousness. They have an ambitious NDC, although one that falls a bit short of getting them onto a 1.5 degrees Celsius trajectory. They should have been at 57 to 63% instead of the 50 to 52% over 2005 levels. But there are a number of questions that need to be addressed. So the first, I think, from a SIDS perspective is, as Alden rightly pointed out, on this question around loss and damage. What does a new, never before seen US commitment to a 1.5 degree limit mean for their positioning on the question of loss and damage? The US has always taken a very clear stance that the question of loss and damage is not necessarily one that needs to be addressed in the multilateral system on climate change. We were able to broker a compromise in the Paris Agreement, and so we have now loss and damage as one of the pillars of the Paris Agreement, but there are still issues that need to be addressed. There's the question of financing for loss and damage, which has not really, haven't heard anything about at all. And this is a little bit, I would say it's interesting because in the White House readout on the summit, they framed their assistance to vulnerable countries, to SIDS in particular, in the context of their domestic climate justice actions. And so you would think with that particular juxtaposition, climate justice internally, domestically, alongside greater international assistance to SIDS and adaptation, etc., you'd think that there's scope there to address this issue of loss and damage, but there's silence on that point. Within the process itself, we are still grappling with this question around governance, whether the WIM is actually governed, the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, whether it's actually governed by the Paris Agreement or under the UNFCCC or both. There have been very difficult discussions between AOSIS and the United States on this topic. So there's an open question, an unanswered question on what this new direction we see coming from the United States will mean in the context of that discussion. A second unanswered question relates to what happens on Article 6. In the Article 6 discussion, AOSIS along with LDCs have been pushing very hard for arrangements that would allow for an overall mitigation in global emissions. So the basic position is that these carbon market arrangements must go beyond offsets. It must be more than the CDM. It must go beyond guaranteeing environmental integrity. It must get into the space of actually delivering on an overall mitigation in global emissions. In this context, AOSIS has also been arguing for a very structured system, whether or not we're dealing with the voluntary carbon market system or the system that's being set up under the Paris Agreement. And the US has been very clear on their preference for the voluntary system, to sort of be lighter on some of the rules and focus more on countries reporting on what they do after the fact. And it would be interesting to see whether the new US approach is going to have an impact on that, and what that impact will be, because it seems to me that in a context where the US has come out very strongly as an advocate for the Glasgow COP in particular, keeping the 1.5 degree limit on the table, there seems to be a linkage between that type of position and then the approach to what happens on carbon markets, because of course there's great potential for those rules to undermine any push to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius achievable and on the table. And then on my final 2 points, in terms of unanswered questions, coming back again to this issue of finance. Within the discussion, we've been having a difficult time on this question of long-term finance and actually getting our act together to even begin the discussion. The US had not been very open to this previously, and at the Chile Madrid COP. And there's now a question as to whether there's going to be a change of approach there, whether in Glasgow we're going to be able to make some progress on this point, whether the US is going to come out in support of, making sure that we have a very science-based discussion on what the new long-term finance goal should be. And on the topic of goals, we're also dealing with this question of the adaptation goal and operationalizing the adaptation goal. And this discussion is one that's very nascent. We came out of the last COP having had a very difficult discussion around when we will be able to even begin to address this issue seriously. Developing countries, I believe, are now all on the same page with an ask for the adaptation goal to be operationalized. And so with this, I think, new political openness to adaptation and the importance of adaptation that we see happening, not just in the US, but also amongst other partners in the developed country world. There's an open question around whether there's going to be a more sincere approach to this question of the operationalization of the adaptation goal. And I think that there are some encouraging signs that we may be able to begin this discussion, but of course, it's definitely not assured. What I would say is that credibility on this question of the importance of adaptation, the importance of being able to address issues that are a priority, in particular for vulnerable countries, is going to ride very much on the approach to this discussion on operationalization of the adaptation goal. So I think I will leave it there. I will leave it there and look forward to the questions to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rueanna. If I can ask maybe just one small clarification regarding the operationalizing, the adaptation goal. I was wondering if you could maybe, for non-experts in the audience, shed a bit more light on what was the vulnerable countries thinking on, what would need to happen for this operationalization to be actually ambitious and to push the ball forward in terms of ambition on adaptation.
Of course, that's the question of the hour, Lola. And I think it's fair to say on all sides that there's still a lot more work to be done in terms of working out an approach on how we operationalize the goal. From the vulnerable country side, thinking has begun here, but it's not very advanced. And so I think I would leave it there, except to say that, of course, there is the push for this to be primarily finance and finance oriented. But I think it's very, very clear that that's probably not going to be a very fruitful starting point for that discussion. And so other approaches would need to be designed.
Thank you very much. And sorry for jumping on this. But I thought you made a lot of extremely interesting points, in particular the kind of semantic shift from 2 degrees from 2 degrees being the reference point to 1.5 degrees being kind of the new reference points in many of the speeches we've seen. I also agree with one of the key takeaways for the summit for me. And thanks also to Alden for clarifying how the US had tried to kind of push the envelope and had supported other countries to come up with new pledges on domestic mitigation and finance. I would now like to turn to our third panelist, Dr. Rashmi from Delhi, from TERI. I mean, there was a lot that was interesting to note coming from India at this summit. In particular, there was a US-India cooperation package that was announced, and I think the summit was also coming in the middle of a very lively debate about the opportunity to join the net zero bandwagon in India. And I think it would be very interesting for you to give us your perspective on where the debate is at in India and how the summit overall was perceived. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lola. Thank you very much. And before I begin, I must thank the other two panelists who have preceded me and have given a wonderful overview of what has happened at the climate summit organized by the US president and its implications for the rest of the world. It has certainly re-established US as the one of the key global players in the field of climate change. For the last 4 or 5 years, not that the Paris Agreement had lost its momentum, but certainly there will be a much greater drive in the effort of the countries who have expressed their commitment to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And this is a very good sign. So I must compliment everyone in the US community and who have pushed the US administration to reaffirm their commitment to the Paris Agreement. So US coming back into the Paris Agreement is a great thing to happen for the world climate community. But I was also struck by Mr. Meyer's reference to two other things, that the US has come back with an ambitious target for 2030. And at the same time, it has also expressed its commitment to follow its goals in terms of mobilizing additional climate finance for the countries that need it, and their strategic push to climate change as part of the global agenda and its linkages with the security, the foreign policy, and the trade policy. Now, it will be interesting to see how the US administration looks at these two things, how they mobilize additional finance and how they develop their instruments in the security policy, the foreign policy, and the trade policy to push the climate agenda. Now, let me come back to the box that Mr. Meyer had presented in terms of the climate ambition expressed by the G20 countries. It's extremely encouraging to note that the US has given a very, very good and ambitious commitment for 2030. But its impact is yet to be seen. You know, as Rueanna was pointing out, the goal of reaching 1.5 degree climate stabilization goal requires the emissions to come down by 45% by 2030. And the NDC, the latest assessments, as Mr. Meyer himself was pointing out, that the emissions gap will close only to the extent of 12 to 14% with these additional commitments and targets adopted by some of the G20 countries. There are other countries which are yet to do so, and he had listed, those countries which have identical or weaker targets by 2030 are, Australia, Brazil, Mexico, Russia, and India, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Indonesia have not indicated what they're going to do. The point that I wanted to make here is that even if all the G20 countries, which contribute to almost 80% of the global emissions, adopt a climate target almost at par with what the US is doing, which doesn't really go along with the principles of the common but differentiated responsibility. Even if you forget those questions of equity here, even if everybody does the maximum effort and pushes its climate agenda nationally in the way US has now decided to do so, shall we be able to close this emissions gap to the extent projected by IPCC by 2030? And this will be, I think, one of the key challenges before COP26. To what extent the nations need to raise their targets? Is there a framework? Is there a global framework for measuring their performance and pushing them to adopt a higher target? That is the most difficult point. At this moment, we don't have any such framework. I mean, the best that I can think of is the Climate Action Tracker, which has come up with a performance assessment of performance of the G20 countries, and they have found that countries like India are the best performers. I mean, the NDCs of India have been rated as the most 2-degree consistent NDCs amongst the G20 countries. There are others, of course, which are doing well. UK, France, they are amongst the leading countries who have shown ambitious NDCs and shown greater performance. But can we adopt a global framework for measuring the performance based on equity, based on their capability, and then attribute these targets rather than simply basing it on the current emissions? Because that is not enough. Even if China decides to raise its emissions, even if India decides to raise its emissions, shall we be able to close this gap? That is the question. And then what kind of framework we are going to adopt is one of the key challenges before us in the run-up to COP26. I'm sure there will be many opportunities for us to revisit this issue. I'm sure the major economies meeting which is going to be revived by the Biden administration will perhaps look at one of these issues. But the other issue to which I wanted to come is the national perspective in India, which you were referring to, Lola, from not only from the net zero perspective, but also from the perspective of energy transition. India's NDC has 3 important goals. And one of them is reduction of emissions intensity of the GDP. It's because India doesn't have an absolute target. India is a growing country, it's a developing country, and it has committed to reduce its emissions intensity of the GDP by 35% by 2030. The latest estimates of 2014, year 2014, say that the emissions intensity has come down by 24%, which means in the next 10 years, it's easily possible to close the rest of the remaining gap in terms of 11%. The second important goal is that of energy transition, clean energy transition, where the goal is of creating a renewable generation capacity of 40% of the total power production. And there again, they have already reached almost 38%. And Prime Minister did mention this in his speech, also perhaps at the climate summit. But is it going to be enough? Because I see that there will be a huge jump in the energy demand by the end of 2030. In the next 10 years, the energy demand in India is going to rise by almost 50% to 60%. And at the end of 2050, the assessments are that it will rise by any time by 300 to 400%. So given this scale of growth in the energy demand in India, how shall this energy transition be financed in terms of supported in terms of finance, in terms of infrastructure and technology? That is the key question. And then this is where the Prime Minister's announcement at the climate summit becomes relevant. He did say, although he didn't announce any enhancement in the NDC goal of India, but he did say that India will adopt a target of installing 450 gigawatts, which means 450,000 megawatts of renewable energy by 2030. Now, it's interesting to note that India's current NDC only mentions the renewable as percentage, in percentage terms, 40% of the total power production. And this 450 gigawatts, if you add it to the current targets, we haven't made any specific calculation on this, but based on the energy modeling, this is going to come somewhere in the range of 45 to 50%, even if there is a huge jump in the energy demand. So this has very large implications. Even if it is not expressly or internationally mentioned, this is a huge jump in the targets, in implicit targets, which India has. This is a point, I think, which needs to be noted. Third was, of course, the carbon sink, where there is a progress, but the progress is mixed. And this is something where we need to do a lot of work in terms of global collaboration and financing, because it's clear that the carbon sinks based only on forestry systems inside the reserve forest is not going to be enough. One has to move outside the forest and create a momentum or a movement for planting trees outside the forest system to be able to support a sustainable carbon sink. And that is another challenge which India faces. But I'll focus on the challenge of energy transition, which Prime Minister has specifically mentioned in the climate summit. So this 450 gigawatts is an implicit addition to the NDC targets, which India already has. Now, what it means for India in terms of a long-term strategy, that is where the India-US strategic cooperation on climate change and clean energy agenda partnership, which he has announced with the US, that becomes relevant. In fact, there is already a history of collaboration between India and US on the clean energy. In 2009, they had announced a program called PACE, Partnership to Advance Clean Energy, which is already there and which is already working. Now, I understand that this partnership will perhaps be scaled up to support this India's huge and ambitious target of 450 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. And this will require a number of things. Interestingly, one of them is, of course, the finance. The scale of finance is humongous. The assessments are that it requires anywhere between $600 billion simply to create this capacity, plus another $250 billion of dollars in creating the grid infrastructure for transporting this energy and making it available to the people who need it. So this is a humongous requirement, and we will need all kinds of innovative financial instruments. And this is what the US partnership is perhaps going to aim at, of mobilizing sufficient finance at large scale and at costs which the Indian system can bear. Currently, the solar energy costs have fallen in India dramatically. They are almost 3 to 4 cents per unit at the moment, which is at par with the rest of the world. And this is going to support the momentum. But the kind of economic, the financial investments which is going to take is huge. And if that doesn't come at the scale at which it is required, it will create a huge stumbling block in the process of transition. The third element which US-India partnership may like to address and perhaps will certainly include in its initiatives is that of industrial decarbonization. Because India's progress towards energy transition has gained a momentum, but it's not enough to change only the energy system. It's important for a country like India, which has to grow hugely in terms of industrial infrastructure, in terms of industrial production, the steel, the cement, the aluminum, the metal-based industries, and all other resource-based industries, where again the assessments are that the demand is going to grow to almost 3 to 4 times. There we will have to bring in technologies which help us in moving towards greater resource efficiency, as well as the transition away from the fossil fuels. And so the liquid fuels, the hydrogen, and these technologies become extremely important. And they are currently in the realm of simply technological development. There is already a group working with Sweden. At the last climate summit in 2019, a business leadership group on industrial transition was announced, where Sweden and India are partners. This group is working, and there are almost 30 members now. So groups like this, the global coalitions like this, will perhaps need to be supported in terms of technological inputs, intellectual property rights, legal support, and also finance to be able to help this transition in the industrial system. My own take here is that we need to come up with innovative financial models to be able to support this kind of industrial transition. We have a good example in the Montreal protocol, where we were able to phase out the ozone depleting substances by supporting the incremental cost of technologies when they were used in the developing countries, and technologies were not compulsorily licensed. The technologies were bought at the normal competitive and commercial price. But we need to come up with a similar kind of innovative systems when we are talking about industrial decarbonizing technologies now in future till 2050. This will be important if we really want to reduce the share of coal. You must have noted that the Prime Minister of India didn't mention either net zero or coal in his speech at the climate summit. And this is significant in the sense that he was perhaps looking at the short term. He mentioned 2030 as the decade of actions. He said that the short-term actions are going to be really important and significant and indicative for the future. If we are able to succeed now in 2030, perhaps then the door opens for 2050. And the door also opens for coal phase down. Coal is currently contributing to the largest share of energy in India. But very interestingly, the share of coal in the total energy production in India has already become static since 2016, which is a good sign. And it's happening only because the newer plants are coming in the field of solar energy, rooftop solar or solar thermal or utility scale solar. So they have ensured that the share of coal remains constant. But the coal will not come down unless we are able to create a base load system for energy based on other fuels. And that is where technology is required and finance is required. After all, coal is a part of the total energy system. So we need to change the entire energy system to be able to take the coal away from the whole system. Fortunately, there are no new plants being planned in India, as far as I know, beyond 2027. There are currently 25,000 megawatts of new coal plants in the pipeline, for which contracting has already been done. But the final electricity plan for India beyond till 2027 doesn't talk of any new plants beyond this. And in fact, another 25,000 megawatts of the plants which are already functioning, they're also going to be shut down. So it's a good sign overall. So I think the future is good And if you take into account the announcements made by the PM at the climate summit, India's NDC is much more ambitious than what it looks like. But success of it depends on what everybody else does in a global framework of measurement and performance. I'll stop here and thank you very much, Lola.
Thank you very much for this extremely rich presentation, which also gives a lot more flavor on what India is doing domestically and how it perceives its own progress, also compared to what all the other countries are doing. I also thank you for mentioning the very critical issue of storage, which often tends to be overlooked. Regarding that, we didn't mention one interesting initiative that was launched at the summit was the Net Zero Producers Forum, which I found was very interesting. It's basically a new forum bringing together Canada, Norway, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, which together represent 40% of the global oil and gas production, to have a cooperative forum to develop, as they say, pragmatic net zero emission strategies. And I thought it was interesting because among the solutions mentioned, controlling methane emissions, advance the circular carbon economy approach. I thought there was an elephant in the room, which was not mentioned, at least in the press release, which was about how do you have a managed strategy to plan a decrease of fossil fuel production eventually once you are going to align with the plans that are made by many other countries. So that was just a very personal comment. There have been quite a few questions in the chat. Thank you very much for this. Feel free to ask a few more in the last half hour that we have. I would maybe like to turn first to Alden. There have been a lot of follow-up questions regarding what the US plans to do or should do. That's the problem with starting off. I think if I try to summarize a lot of these, there was some clarification questions regarding how is the US actually integrating climate and its overarching foreign policy framework, and its approach to trade or to security. A question in the chat was mentioning, in particular, the security aspect. How is the US going to integrate climate in this broader framework? And I think this connects tightly to another very important stream of questions that came from the audience, but also from other panelists, which was, you very aptly recognize that the US still has a lot of stepping up to do in terms of finance, and this relates also to what it can do regarding adaptation and the other elephant in the room, which is the question of loss and damage. I was wondering if this relative, well, not delay, but there have been a lot of progress made on mitigation announcements, comparatively less so, I would argue, on finance. I wonder if that is also tied to what you described as the complex domestic politics and the fact that in the current system, even though you have an administration that is willing to move forward, the fact that it doesn't control the Senate might hamper its efforts. So maybe focusing on these aspects of the foreign policy and the finance question, how do you see the current US politics enabling or hampering progress on these two fronts? Sorry, that's quite a big question. But
Thanks, Lola. Yeah, those are fairly comprehensive questions, but let me try to take a stab at them. On the question around security and trade, I think it's very clear this administration intends to integrate climate into those tracks. John Kerry himself comes obviously from a security background, the founder of the American Security Project. He's on the National Security Council, the chief of staff for the National Security Council. The deputy national security advisor is John Kerry's former chief of staff. So this is woven through the entire strategy, and you will see this when the president comes to Europe after the G7 summit for the EU-US dialogue and for the NATO summit. that he gets it, that this is a security issue. And there's all kinds of spin-offs there in terms of implications for military preparedness and readiness, for migration, for disruption and failed states of the kind we saw in Syria, which you can argue was partly climate induced because of the drought and agricultural crop failures that preceded the civil war there. So this is very much on their mind. In terms of trade, it's an evolving landscape. The US Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, was just recently confirmed by the US Senate. She gave a presentation last week at the Center for American Progress, which I would encourage people to go watch. You can watch it on their website, and she talks about the need for a comprehensive greening of trade policy, which means any new trade agreements between the US and EU or UK or Asia or others need to integrate climate at the core, Paris compatibility at the core. Existing provisions of trade agreements like the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement need to be enforced, not just when it comes to workers' rights, but when it comes to environmental impacts and social impacts. So I think you're going to see more here. There's the potential for some friction between the US and the EU around one of the issues that Dr. Rashmi raised, which is trade sanctions or carbon border adjustments on countries that are not doing the same in terms of domestic action as others. Of course, the US is constrained by the fact that there's not, at this point at least in the Congress, to vote to pass a substantial price on carbon as other countries have done. Ideally, that's where the US should be moving, joining Canada, the EU with the ETS and others that have started to put substantial prices on carbon. But that's not in the cards probably, at least for the next couple of years. So that tension needs to be managed. Now, when you come to finance, as you say, it's a very complex issue. I saw a question in the chat about the fair shares approach. On a purely equitable basis of fair shares, responding not just to current emissions, but historic responsibility, the US, as Rueanna said, should be doing more domestically on its emissions, going to net zero more quickly to create space for developing countries to take a little longer to get to that 45% average that we need by 2030. And just to note, that's only to give us, I think it was a 66 probability of staying within 1.5 degrees, which is still a 1/3 probability of exceeding it. And I think, as we'll see from the IPCC forthcoming report, 1.5 may not be as safe as some thought it used to be. So the US clearly needs to do more on domestic ambition, but I would say that the 50% is a huge leap forward and may be the sort of boundary of what is politically plausible now with the current makeup of Congress. It will be helped by the states and cities and businesses and investors that were part of the We Are Still In movement, which are also pushing on the ground for greater ambition. But the part that's gotten much less attention is the finance part, because on a fair shares basis, that domestic emissions reduction ought to be accompanied not by the $5.5 billion a year that the US wants to ramp up to in climate assistance by 2024, but by tens or maybe hundreds of billions of dollars in finance assistance to help decarbonize other countries, developing countries, as they grow. And from a least cost perspective, a lot of the low cost opportunities are in places like India, as Dr. Rashmi said, to develop a decentralized grid incorporating efficiency, renewables, and storage to leapfrog over the centralized coal model. But that's not going to happen without the hundreds of billions of assistance that's needed, and that's just for India. So you take that and you spread that more widely. We're talking a lot of money here, and the US political system has not come to grips with that, to be frank. And I would put some of the blame for that on NGOs in the US. We have not mounted the same kind of campaign around ramping up international climate finance that we have on domestic ambition, on sectoral emissions reduction in transportation, electricity, on domestic impacts and just transition and environmental justice. I think there's a whole need for a much bigger campaign that integrates security, faith, business, labor, development, environmental, and other perspectives in a massive push, particularly in the Congress, to change the thinking around this. It's easy for a member of Congress to see the benefits of doing something domestically that cleans up local air pollution or creates jobs or develops clean technology manufacturing in their district or state. it's harder to communicate the benefits of ramping up international climate finance in those domestic political terms. And I think we need to do a much better job of that if we're going to get up to scale. The final point I would make is knowing that the administration is putting a lot of emphasis on pressuring the private sector through this risk disclosure, asset stress testing, trying to on fossil fuel finance, not only from countries, but corporations, pressing the World Bank and other multilateral development banks to climate-proof their portfolios, because I think it realizes the limits of how fast it can push Congress to go along with ramping up climate finance. But this is a very tough issue, and loss and damages, as others mentioned, is a very toxic issue in both parties on the Hill and in past Democratic and Republican administrations. It almost brought the COP in Doha, Qatar in 2012 crashing down. And I and others had to do extensive shuttle diplomacy between the US and AOSIS in the closing hours of that conference to persuade the US not to crash the whole COP over the loss and damage issue. So this is something we need to have a much more in-depth discussion and strategy around.
Thank you very much. I would like to turn to Rueanna now. Well, you very clearly laid out the unanswered questions for the US regarding, how it should address loss and damage, which Alden just touched upon quickly. Going beyond environmental integrity in terms of international carbon markets to ensure that there is actually an overall mitigation progress made through this mechanism. Progress on post-2025 finance and defining a new goal, and also operationalizing the long-term adaptation goal. So these are very comprehensive, but maybe I would like to focus in one of the questions from the chat is saying that as the US is using resilience as the primary language, whether the resilience and adaptation notions from the vulnerables point of view should not be conflated, whether they have a different scope and meaning, whether it's even important to clarify them. I have the impression that from the UN perspective, or from the UK perspective, that the two tend to be conflated, but considering how these notions of adaptation, resilience, and loss and damage can be seen as very closely related, I would really welcome your thoughts on this.
Thanks for that, Lola. And yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I'll start by saying that I don't know if anybody wins in a discussion where we try to unpick adaptation and resilience. Even when we look at the Paris Agreement, Article 2, and we look at how the adaptation goal is framed, it's framed in the context of increasing the ability to adapt, et cetera, and foster climate resilience. So climate resilience and this move toward climate resilience is already seen as part and parcel of overall adaptation efforts within the context of the agreement. That being said, in a UN setting, there is a difference in meaning between resilience and adaptation. So I would say that maybe the ship has sailed in terms of deciding between one or the other in the climate change context. But I would not support the idea that resilience can replace adaptation. Resilience is an idea that comes out of the disaster risk reduction, that framework. And the onus on building resilience, the onus on any individual country for building resilience is on the country itself, which is quite different from adaptation, where it's very clear and has always been clear within the UNFCCC that developing countries are to receive assistance, in particular those that are quite vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. They are to receive assistance in order to be able to adapt. And so that's really the key difference that I would say between the two terms, which from a vulnerable perspective, really makes it clear that the priority in the context of the climate change setting should be on adaptation, even though resilience building is also important, and as we've seen, has also now been included in the fold in the context of the Paris Agreement. I think if we look at IPCC reports, in particular, the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius, it's very clear that they address adaptation. I think once we stick to the scientific framing on adaptation, and also this idea around the fact that there are limits to adaptation and limits to adaptive capacity, then we will be able to find common ground around what we're discussing, and it then becomes, I think, a lot less necessary to have this discussion where we have to agree on either one or the other, or we have to clearly define the limits or the differences between adaptation and resilience, because that's the type of discussion where I think nobody wins. Least of all the countries who require the assistance for their adaptation efforts urgently. And as Alden hinted and mentioned as well, even the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, as we see from that IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius, even that limit already includes extremely dangerous impacts of climate change. And so it's definitely a question of doing both. I would say resilience is slightly more limited than adaptation because it comes out of a disaster risk reduction framework. It focuses more on disasters, and as we know, loss and damage also in particular goes well beyond the disaster framework. And so there are a lot of reasons why I don't think we need to be discussing the difference between one or the other, but we definitely need to be able to keep the focus on adaptation. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think you managed to pin down brilliantly a very technical question to a broader political point. We had also some very interesting questions in the chat regarding the fact that we didn't discuss much about the role of China beyond, what Alden mentioned at the beginning, that China said that it would control more strictly its coal expansion and gradually phase it down in the 15th five-year plan. And maybe that's obviously one big conversation that you also mentioned regarding India, Dr. Rashmi, the fact that India would have to move forward with, considering a peaking of coal and declining the usage of coal, and mentioned that it was already making progress in that sphere. I think another point that I would like to mention in regard to the China point is there was also an announcement that maybe going forward beyond the Leaders Summit, the EU-India Heads of State Summit is planned in a few weeks' time. And there have been some leaks about a potential connectivity partnership between EU and India that might be seen as a rival to the Belt and Road Initiative. So it might be premature to think about that, but maybe in the context of the Leaders Summit, how could India also take advantage of this US being back in the game as a new shift in the climate geopolitics to also take a larger place in the geopolitics and maybe also assert itself vis-a-vis China in terms of climate action and beyond in terms of international power.
Thank you, Lola. I wouldn't be able to comment on the China question because I would present it more from the Indian perspective. But one thing was clear in the climate summit, that the Chinese president did talk about the emissions peak of his country. And that was, he said that China would be able to peak its emissions by 2030. Whatever that means. The implication is clear that for any country to be able to bring the production or consumption of coal down, it is important for the country to peak its emissions. And in India, that situation is still not foreseen in the immediate future, at least not till 2030. I mean, all kinds of energy modeling or climate modeling that we have seen here doesn't foresee the emissions peaking before 2040. It's possible that with the degree of rapidity in the energy transition, this might be a little advanced. But the degree of its preponement of the emissions peak will depend to the extent that we are able to infuse renewables into the system in a much larger manner. And that requires additional technologies and additional finance. So for the coal to really come down in the overall, in absolute sense, not in the relative sense, but in the absolute sense, if it has to come down, it will depend on the degree by which we can scale up the renewable energy. Coal is a part of the overall energy system, after all. And currently it's anywhere in the range of 55 to 60% of India's energy production energy. And and the renewable energy system, the capacity has reached 38%, but in terms of meeting the energy demand, it's still in the range of 12 to 13%. The rest of the demand is met from other energy sources like coal, hydro, nuclear, and fossil fuels. So to be able to meet the goals of effective and comprehensive energy transition and shutdown of the coal plants in absolute terms, we will need to transform the energy system as well, and also decarbonize the industry system. And for both, we need investments in the grid, in the energy storage, in hydrogen economy. That's the key challenge. Not that there is no progress as far as coal is concerned. As I was mentioning, from 2016 onwards, there have been the share of the coal in electricity production has remained static. It hasn't gone up, which means even if the energy demand and energy capacity is growing, the coal as share is not growing. So coal will slowly decline. We don't have to be really concerned with that because the solar has become cheaper than coal today. But it's only in terms of variable cost. If you look at the total fixed costs, including the grid infrastructure, the grid integration costs, and the base load costs, it is still higher. And the capacity utilization of renewables is only 24%, whereas the capacity utilization of any coal plant is in the range of 65%. So there are a number of other second order or third order economic variables which have to be taken into account when we really look at coal phase out in vis-a-vis renewables scale and up. So this is a complex question, and it really demands application of new technologies and finance. But fortunately, I must give the sense is that coal, the future of the coal is limited, and if not by 2035, by 2040, certainly it will come down to a much lower and manageable level as in the overall energy system. The second question which you mentioned about EU-India, dialogue and the summit that is going to take place. Some of them are at the moment still at the discussion stage. They haven't become a part of the formal policy, but India has been talking to EU for a long-term relationship in many areas, in terms of security, in terms of trade. You must be aware that there is already a talk in terms of a formal trade agreement taking place, which is currently on the hold because of certain differences in the way they look at certain key issues. But there is a keenness on both sides to progress on that. Similarly on the security side, and similarly on the infrastructure side. The Prime Minister has been emphasizing the coalition for resilient infrastructure for a disaster. And this is his pet subject. So wherever there is infrastructure investment involved, he would like to get as many countries on board as possible. And EU is certainly one of the key targets from this point of view. So these are coalitions in the International Solar Alliance, of course, is another major coalition where both India and EU have similar and common interests. The CDRI is another one. Similarly, I think in the future, when agreements take place, there will be other elements which will strengthen this relationship. And all of them will have a climate implication as well, because the investments, kind of investments that come in, will have some, conditionalities or some vision attached to this partnership. So I'm quite hopeful that this will have a good and beneficial or positive impact.
Thank you very much. And for those that wouldn't know, the CDRI is the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which is led by India. Maybe one follow-up question to all panelists, but maybe particularly to Alden regarding the role that China might play going forward. And I think, interestingly, in advance of the summit, there was a little diplomatic ballet between all the sides of the triangle between US, China, and Europe, and probably on the European side, some legitimate questions about, now that the US are back, does that mean that the EU leadership is comparatively seen as, less key to also engage with China? And I was wondering, what was your take on this, and trying to move forward from the carbon neutrality pledge done in September by Xi Jinping to more commitments on short-term actions that are aligned with this carbon neutrality goal, for instance?
Yeah, thanks, Lola. I mean, it was very interesting to watch that choreography in the run-up to the summit. I would say that the US recognizes, given the overall difficult relationship it has with China on trade, on human rights, on security, intellectual property, other issues, it doesn't have a lot of direct leverage. I think it was good for Special Envoy Kerry to work with Xie Zhenhua to get the joint statement out of the Shanghai meeting. But with some legitimacy, China sees the US as needing to catch up. China never pulled out of the Paris Agreement. China is on track to meet its Paris commitments, even though it needs to greatly increase those commitments to be consistent with the 2060 net zero carbon dioxide emissions commitment President Xi made last September at the UN General Assembly. So I think part of the US strategy on working so intensively on Japan, on South Korea, on India, and to a lesser extent on Australia, was to increase the tension in the system by showing that other countries in the Indo-Pacific region are moving ahead on decarbonization more quickly, and China needs to do more to live into its net zero pledge. I would also say that I think that's part of the initiative behind the US-India joint announcement on technology and finance, and the work the US is also doing with other countries in the region in collaboration with some of the other developed countries, is to create an alternative platform and model to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which has been heavily subsidizing coal development through Asia, to say there are other ways to get the finance and capacity you need to pursue a cleaner path. Because if a finance or energy minister in a developing country in Asia is faced with a choice of how you meet the needs to lift people out of energy poverty, and China is offering subsidized loans and technology for coal, and there's really no package being offered for the cleaner alternative, you're going to make the choice based on the priority of lifting people out of poverty and electrifying villages. And I think the US gets that, which is why they're trying to mobilize a much bigger package. I think, as I said in the opening, there's a need for much greater collaboration between the US, EU, and UK in the run-up to COP26 on a set of sticks and carrots that will provide incentives for China to move more quickly. I've been told by colleagues in China to watch the elaboration of the energy and industrial detailed plans of the 14th five-year plan that was unveiled in March, which will be done later this year, as places where China could signal its willingness to show greater leadership on moving towards that net zero goal. So watch that space. We don't know when or where those signals will come, but I think it's quite clear that China needs to do more before COP26, and it knows that, and is trying to figure out how to deliver on that.
Thank you very much for these points, and I think everyone would agree that for a country like China, as you know, in the logic of the Paris Agreement, any commitment anyway always comes from the domestic politics and the national willingness to move forward. That is coming in a broader environment of, you know, pressure from peers and from the civil society, from the business environment. But ultimately, these decisions are made by the countries alone. One last thing regarding that I want to mention is I find it interesting. We've said many times that this summit could be considered a success because the US stepped up, that there was taken together major ramping up in ambition from a range of countries. I think one thing that I found very heartwarming as a person working on climate issues for many years was that the Paris Agreement mechanism of also pressure from peers also seems to have worked, because a country like Japan, which submitted a first NDC, which was widely considered to be insufficient considering its own means and capacities, because of, you know, some diplomacy behind the scenes, was also encouraged to submit a newer and a stronger NDC that seems more aligned with what Japan can do also for its own benefits. I don't think we have time for any more questions, but I would like to take one last opportunity to warmly thank our three panelists for their excellent interventions. I think we've been really blessed to have your perspectives from very different parts of the world regarding this leadership summit. I'm glad to say that I felt like the mood was overall, for once, maybe rather positive, even though we all acknowledge that a lot more needs to be done. Thank you very much to everyone else as well for joining in and sending very interesting questions. And thanks to our IDDRI colleagues for organizing this webinar. Thank you very much for your time, and have a good afternoon.